I'd like to call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. We're now beginning the public review of the Auditor General's Report 2017, Independent Auditor's Report, Climate Change in the Northwest Territories. I do apologize to anyone who was waiting for this meeting to start. We were pushed back by half an hour, but we are on track now, and I'll ask committee members to identify themselves for the record, and we will start with Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. R.J. Simpson, the MLA for Heber North. Welcome.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Good morning, Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Good morning, Michael Nunley, MLA for Ditchell.
Good morning, Danny McNeely, Sawtooth Region.
Good morning and welcome, Corey Van Thine, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Good morning. Welcome, Shane Thompson, Nahende.
And I'm Kieron Testart, member for Cam Lake and Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. With me at the table are Committee Clerk Jennifer Frankie Smith and our Committee Research Advisor, Ms. April Taylor. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Michael Ferguson, Auditor General of Canada. If you could introduce yourself and your officials for the record.
Shall I start my opening statement?
Just introductions.
Okay. So I'm Michael Ferguson, Auditor General of Canada and Auditor General for the Northwest Territories. And I'm accompanied by Glenn Wheeler and Aaron Jelinek.
Thank you. And for the interest of anyone who has joined us today who has lunch plans, our plan is to hear from the Auditor General first, and then to take a break for lunch, and then we will reconvene at 1:30 to hear from the Deputy Ministers of Environment and Natural Resources and the Department of Infrastructure. I understand Mr. Ferguson will make himself available to the media before he leaves Yellowknife to answer any questions you may have about our proceedings today. If there are any questions, they can be asked either outside of this committee room or in the Great Hall. In order to promote a smooth discussion and exchange of ideas in this review, the committee has decided to adopt a process for questioning, which will allow each committee member, when recognized by the chair, a 10-minute block of time for posing direct questions to a witness. The chair, as myself, will intervene only when warranted or when the time for questions has expired. And I'll ask that if a witness needs to direct the line of inquiry to another witness at the table, that Mr. Ferguson, you will do so, and so we can get the record clear. Now I'll ask Mr. Ferguson to proceed with any opening comments, and then we'll move to questions from committee. Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to discuss our report on climate change in the Northwest Territories. The report was tabled in the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories on October 18th, 2017. In this audit, we examined the efforts of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the infrastructure to meet the Territory's commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change impacts. This audit was part of a larger climate change audit initiative which involved several legislative audit offices across Canada. Each audit office developed similar audit approaches and questions to examine climate change action within their governments. To date, 9 out of 12 audit reports on climate change have been tabled, and a report summarizing these audits will be issued in the spring. According to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the impact of climate change on the Northwest Territories is significant and widespread. The department has reported that the territory's climate has warmed 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. Sea levels have risen, which has caused significant coastal erosion, and permafrost is thawing, which has caused shifting and structural problems in buildings. Climate change affects people, including their food and fuel security, their ability to travel in and out of their communities, and their traditional way of life. Overall, we found that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources didn't provide the leadership that the territory required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change impacts. For the past 10 years, the department has repeatedly committed to creating a territorial strategy for adapting to climate change. We found that the department hadn't developed one, and, as a result, hadn't set out clear and specific adaptation priorities to address the climate change risks that the territory faces. Instead, the department focused on territorial greenhouse gas emission strategies, but these strategies lacked meaningful targets and didn't include concrete actions for major emitters. The department also failed to correct long-standing deficiencies in its climate change leadership. Specifically, it didn't determine the resources or authority it needed to carry out its leadership responsibilities or establish a network of professionals to support action and the exchange of information on climate change. In the absence of effective departmental leadership, other territorial departments and communities pursued their own adaptation efforts. The result was a piecemeal approach to adaptation, and the government didn't know whether the territory was doing enough to adapt to climate change impacts or whether it was addressing the areas of greatest risk. Through our audit work, we observed a pattern where the Department of Environment and Natural Resources made multiple commitments related to climate change, but didn't follow through on them. We saw considerable activity around the development of greenhouse gas emission strategies, but then no monitoring of commitments or reporting on results. We noted several commitments to develop a territorial climate change adaptation strategy over the past decade that weren't fulfilled. As part of this audit, we also examined specific adaptation efforts undertaken by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the Department of Infrastructure. We found a similar pattern where both departments made commitments important for climate change adaptation, but didn't follow through on many of the specific actions they determined were necessary to safeguard people, wildlife, and infrastructure from the impacts of climate change. For example, in the absence of an overall adaptation plan for wildlife, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources set out management plans to protect some vulnerable wildlife like certain caribou species. However, there were gaps in its monitoring, and some of these species were not monitored at all. The Department of Infrastructure identified climate change risks to public buildings and roads that could cause structural damage or failure, and established practices to protect public infrastructure from these risks. However, while we found the department carried out these practices for roads in most cases, it didn't do so for public buildings. For example, the department often didn't inspect and clear snow from the roofs of buildings, including some prone to heavy snow accumulation. It also didn't remove snow from building foundations to prevent thawing permafrost and possible structural problems. This is important because residents rely on these departments to uphold their commitments to manage and adapt to the impacts of climate change, some of which have the potential to be severe and costly. We made 8 recommendations to help the 2 departments meet their climate change commitments and better adapt to the impacts of climate change. Both departments have agreed to implement our recommendations. In our report, we acknowledged that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources was in the process of developing a climate change strategic framework. In our view, creating such a framework is a start, but more needs to be done. Establishing the appropriate authority and leadership will be critical to the success of this framework. Also critical will be the accountability for results and a continued focus on the framework beyond its release, something we didn't see in past strategies. Mr. Chair, your committee may wish to seek details from department officials on how they intend to uphold commitments to reduce territorial greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change impacts in the Northwest Territories. Specifically, you may wish to ask the Department of Environment and Natural Resources how it intends to fulfill its leadership role on climate change and how it plans to maintain a continued focus on climate change commitments. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening statement. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I'll now turn to committee members. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the benefit of people who are hearing about this for the first time, can you just please provide an overview of the audit process. What is it exactly that you're measuring when you audit compliance with climate change? Thank you.
So what we do when we do an audit is we establish an objective, and in this case we wanted to know whether the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the Department of Infrastructure took adequate steps to meet their commitments to reduce territorial greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change impacts in the Northwest Territories. So I think the important, one of the important words in there is what is their commitments, okay? So what we are looking at is what have the departments committed to do to either reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to adapt important assets, I guess, of the Northwest Territories, including assets like wildlife, what they are doing to help adapt to the impacts of climate change. So what we did was we identified what those two departments committed to do, and then we look to see whether they have actually done what they committed to do. And I think, that's where we come up with things like, over the last 10 years, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources has said that it will put in place a strategy for adaptation to climate change. And we saw that, even at the end of our audit period in June 2017, despite that 10 years worth of commitments, there was still no approved strategy for adaptation.
Thank you. My next question is how you gather that information. Do you interview people, or is it strictly a paper exercise? We interview a lot of people. We will pick different communities to go to, so we will go out and we will look at the assets as well. So we don't just do it from Ottawa or from Yellowknife. We will go out to the communities. We sit down and have a lot of interviews with departmental officials, but also with other stakeholders as well. We will attend different meetings to see how those meetings are conducted. And then, of course, we will also look at files and documentation about the activities of the departments. Mm-hmm. And at what point are your findings shared with the department?
Well, during the course of the audit, we have a number of conversations with the department. So, we will talk to them about things, and I guess in the course of those conversations, departments will know, what types of things that we seem to be identifying as potential problems. But then, partway through the audit, we will start to provide them more specifics of where we think the issues are. Getting towards the reporting end of the audit, we will provide them with a draft copy of our report with all of our findings in it so that they can provide us any additional evidence that they may have, or so that they can see how we are framing specific issues. We will give them an opportunity to make comments on that draft. Then we will provide them a revised draft that will take into account their comments. And then we may still make a few small changes after that before we issue the final report.
And when we are talking about interacting with the department, is that the civil service or the political staff or both?
It would be the civil service.
Okay. Yeah, those are my questions. Thank you. I just wanted to set the scene about how the information is gathered and processed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Ferguson, what was the audit period for this audit?
It was, we state that in the audit, and it can be found on page 28 of the audit report. And the audit covered the period between the 1st of April 2013 and the 30th of June 2017.
Thank you. And how many hours from your office did the audit require?
I will ask Ms. Jelenic to answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It took around 6,000 hours for us to complete this audit.
Thank you, Ms. Jelenic. And what was the process that you took to agree on this audit to look at this area of government?
So there are a number of things that we do to identify audit topics. One thing that we will do is we will look at where we feel there are risks across sort of all government departments in the Northwest Territories to identify which topics that we believe need to be audited. In this case, though, we also took into account some other factors, which was many legislative audit offices in Canada, so at the provincial level and also ourselves federally, had been planning to do or had recently done audits on climate change adaptation or reducing emissions. So we felt that this was a good opportunity to coordinate as many of those legislative audit offices as possible to look at similar questions around climate change, to try and get reports out, around the same time frame on these same issues. So as I said in my opening statement, to date, 9 different jurisdictions have recently made reports on climate change, either adaptation or emissions, and there will be 3 more that will also be doing that. So part of it in this case was trying to do this audit at the same time that a similar audit was being done in other jurisdictions to get a bit of a national view of what's going on in the climate change file.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. We'll now go to Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I guess I'd like to start with just quoting back one of your overall findings, and I think it's the most serious thing that came out of the audit. Overall, we found that Department of Environment and Natural Resources did not fully fulfill its leadership role and meet its commitments on climate change. The department did not identify the risks to the NWT posed by climate change, establish a territorial strategy to adapt to climate change, or provide departments and communities with easy access to information needed to take action to address climate change impacts. That's a pretty serious finding about a lack of leadership here. So can you just explain how you went about assessing leadership role by the department? What sort of things did you look into, and how did you arrive at that conclusion? Thanks.
And I think maybe the first thing that I will do, and I'm referring here to paragraph 57 in the audit report, and there we identify that more than 10 years ago, the Department of Environment itself identified deficiencies that affected its climate change leadership. So, and they said that it included insufficient funding, insufficient authority to hold other territorial departments accountable for their climate change and greenhouse gas emission commitments, and no formal way to communicate and coordinate with groups involved in climate change. So those were things that the department itself had identified as deficiencies and obstacles, I guess, to it being able to provide the appropriate level of leadership on this file. Well, in the course of our audit, we found that those same issues were still around. And we made a recommendation that they need to assess whether they have sufficient resources and whether they have sufficient authority. In 2007, the department committed also to put in place a climate change network to share information and to connect people and promote climate change action in the Northwest Territories. But again, we found that even though the department had on a couple of times attempted to establish those networks, they were never established. So this has been a long-standing issue, and we're not the first ones to raise it. It was the department itself that raised it, and we found that in the course of our audit, they still hadn't found ways to resolve those issues.
Okay, thanks for that. You mentioned that you've done, or that you've been involved in audits, or that there have been audits that have been done in 9 of 12 jurisdictions. Are there any lessons that we could learn from those other audits in terms of leadership on climate change? Are there specific structures, ways of capturing authority in legislation or policies or practices that can help build leadership on climate change? Thanks.
as I said in my opening comments, we are in the process of putting together a summary report that will look at the audit results from all 12 of those different jurisdictions to try and draw some of those points out, and that will be available probably in March or April. But I think in terms of leadership in general, there can be many ways of getting at leadership. Some of it might be organizational structure. Organizational structure might be important. Some of it might be very clearly stating who's got the authority for what and who's responsible for what. But another way, I guess, also of providing leadership in this type of file would be just to have the different players commit on paper to what they are going to do. Okay, so if there is, if the Department of Environment, for example, has a strategy that says, they want certain reductions in greenhouse gases, for example, but to get to those reductions, if it requires other departments to play a role, well, then maybe one way to get the leadership is to make sure that it's written on paper and that those other departments sign off on something on paper about what they are going to do to help the Department of Environment meet the overall government's goals. So the leadership can take many different forms. At the end of the day, there needs to be something that is enforceable to make sure all of the players are known, all of the roles and responsibilities are known, and all of the deliverables and sort of the accountabilities are known. All of those factors need to be in place, no matter sort of what the structure is around it.
Thanks. Can someone from your team talk a little bit about what you understand the current resourcing level at the time of the audit was with regard to climate change within environment and natural resources? Thanks.
I'll ask Ms. Jelinek to talk to that.
At the time we were thank you, Mr. Chair. At the time we were undertaking our audit, there was a directorate of 4 when we first started. Those numbers had dwindled down to 2. And our understanding was those positions weren't backfilled. That may have changed after the June 30th time that we were doing the work, but definitely suffice it to say, and we make a comment about this in our report as well, generally speaking, people working within that directorate have been communicating to us that their roles and responsibilities and their workloads have been increasing, but their resources correspondingly hadn't been.
Okay, thanks. What sort of policies, procedures, structural changes might you suggest or recommend to, and I think we've been talking a little bit about some of this, to enable ENR to actually play the leadership role here? Do we need a cabinet level committee? Do we need a written policy on climate change? Do we need to ensure that submissions to the Financial Management Board have climate change consideration built into them? Do we need training of Financial Management Board analysts on climate change so they can better assess proposals that come to them? Those are the sort of things that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. But if you have any specific suggestions around how we can build the leadership capacity, you talked about resources and authority. How can we build the resources and authority within ENR to enable them to play the leadership role that they are supposed to have on this file? Thanks.
So I think the way that I'll answer this is, I'll go back sort of to the starting point, which is, and again, what we identified was that for 10 years, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources has committed to put in place a strategy, for example, on adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and there still was not a strategy in place. Today we see that they are they have a draft framework, so again, they're trying to put in place a strategy, but we've seen many attempts at strategies before. So there needs to be a strategy, there needs to be an action plan to implement that strategy. There needs to be ways of being able to identify whether the strategy is actually being implemented. All of those targets need to be monitored, and there needs to be public reporting. So those are sort of the components of what needs to be done to actually get to real action, and the actions need to be specific and measurable so that people will know whether they are being done. Then around all of that, you need all of the different mechanisms, the leadership and the different mechanisms, again, to make sure roles and responsibilities are understood, that the overall direction is understood. So the overall direction of what the government is trying to achieve needs to be in that strategy and in those action plans. Again, the roles and responsibilities need to be clear. The accountabilities need to be clear. So it could include a different organizational structure. It could include different oversight. It could include different due diligence from the center on the file. It could include many different things. All of those are different considerations, but at the end of the day, there needs to be a very clear leadership structure that is going to make sure that not only will there be a strategy, but the strategy will be implemented, and there will be a way of knowing whether the strategy has achieved what it was intended to achieve.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. Mr. O'Reilly, your time's expired. We'll then move on to Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move on to the Department of Infrastructure. My first question is, when documents were requested from the department, was the department forthcoming with the documents? Were they, or did it take a while? And what I'm getting at is that I'm just trying to get to the bottom of their system. Are the documents easily accessible, I guess, to the department, and so that they could easily hand them over to you, or was it, or is there a system of amalgamating the documents and filing them and having access to them, was it a little jumbled? Thank you.
So in terms of the Department of Infrastructure, for example, one of the things that we looked at was the work that they did to inspect culverts. And we identified that the department did conduct overall regular inspections of large culverts. I think 90% of the large culverts that we reviewed were inspected when they were supposed to be inspected. And all of the information about the large culverts existed within the Department of Infrastructure headquarters, so it was easy for us to get that information. On the other hand, we said that the department didn't conduct regular inspections of small culverts, and only 50% of the small culverts that we reviewed were inspected. The responsibility to inspect small culverts rests with the regional offices in the Department of Infrastructure. And we found that we couldn't get information from headquarters about whether those small culverts had been inspected or not. We had to go out and get that information from the different regions, and that was a fairly time-consuming exercise to be able to get that information. And why that's important is because overall, again, the department has set a requirement for itself to make sure its culverts, both large and small, are inspected according to a certain schedule. And so they need to make sure that they have enough information to know themselves whether they are respecting that schedule. And as I said, in this case, we were able to identify that they were only inspecting about 50% of the small culverts, and maybe that shows that there was a lack of the flow of adequate information between the regions and the head office for the head office to know that not all of the small culverts were being inspected.
Thank you for that information. And you also looked at inspections of ice roads, and how did those fare? Thank you.
In terms of ice roads, there were a couple of things that we identified for the Department of Infrastructure. First of all, that the department did measure ice thickness, in most cases as required by its own guidelines for the ice roads. But it didn't do it in all cases. We found that it had measured the thickness 81% of the time when it was required to for the roads that we reviewed. So there were still some that it didn't. And in fact, we found one instance where the department didn't test the ice thickness for an ice road before it increased the amount of weight that was allowed to travel over that road. So Generally, 81% of the time, they did what they were supposed to do on ice thickness based on the sample we took. But there were still some situations where they should have been doing better testing. The other thing was that the department, they also did conduct their inspections to detect hazards and cracks that pose risks to ice road integrity, and we found 90% of the time that they did meet their guideline to inspect those types of integrity issues for ice roads. So, again, overall, we felt that they were doing most of what they said they needed to do, but there's still some room for improvement.
Thank you for that answer. So 81% of the time they tested for the ice for thickness when they were supposed to, which is still 1 out of 5 times they didn't. So those, it's quite a large number in the grand scheme of things. And you mentioned the flow of information from the regions to headquarters. Do you think the systems that are in place right now that the Department of Infrastructure uses to gather information are adequate? Is this a case of people just not utilizing the systems properly, or are the systems inadequate to facilitate a proper flow of information?
Well, the audit, in the scope of this audit, we didn't specifically examine the system and that the department was using to collect that information. But I think, again, when they had a requirement to make sure that the small culverts were inspected according to a schedule, and only 50% of that happened. And for us to get that information, we had to go out to the regions. I think that sort of is enough of an indication that the department should look at its information systems itself to identify whether it's getting the proper flow of information, but that was not a specific line of inquiry that we included in the course of the audit.
Thank you for that. And is headquarters supposed to monitor whether or not the regions are doing these inspections, or is that something that is strictly handled by the regions?
Well, again, when a department makes a commitment, or a department has guidelines for things that are supposed to happen, whether it does them in headquarters, or whether it does them regionally, or whether it does them through a third party, the headquarters unit has a responsibility to make sure that those commitments are actually being respected. So even though the bulk of the work may be done in the regions, headquarters should have some way of making sure and documenting that they are sure that those commitments and requirements are actually being fulfilled by the regions, and if they are not, they should figure out what's the reason that they are not.
Thank you for that. And just the final question about the documents. What was the quality of the documents you received? Were they in a format that was easily readable, or was it just a scanned copy of a piece of paper indicating that there might not be a real electronic system in place?
So I'll ask Ms. Jelinek to respond to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the information that we were provided, yes, it was clear we could determine whether an inspection had taken place or not. They were scanned copies because that's what we asked for, because we have to have evidence that something's actually transpired. But they were inspection reports that we could see the asset or the road and what had or hadn't been done. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and nothing further in this line. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Bailey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question there, Mr. Ferguson, is during the course of your audit and reviewing the materials, have you found a traditional knowledge or TK component as part of the department's directives, or a policy reflecting the usage of TK knowledge? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I think in general what I'd say to that, Mr. Chair, is what we identified was that there are more opportunities, particularly for the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, to to engage with different stakeholders about the whole areas of, greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas targets, the impact of the impact of climate change, and the ways of adapting to climate change. So I can't get down sort of into the specifics of, the types of information that they are having, but generally they need to have more consultations with stakeholders to gather and share information to better understand how to adapt to the impacts of climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. My next question is just to build on what you had mentioned about consultations. In your recommendations, would you feel free in saying that consultations should take place on a regional level for the stakeholders within that region? Take my region, for example. I represent 5 communities. You think there should be more periodic, routinely consultations on climate change, and more specifically, the progress climate change adaptation has made? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I think, again, for the department to understand what needs to be done to adapt to climate change, to adapt to the impacts of climate change, it needs to know what those impacts are. Northwest Territories, obviously, is a very large place, so it needs to understand what those impacts might be at a regional level. How it divides it up and who it consults with, the department or departments, I guess, would need to determine that. But certainly getting information at the regional and local level would be something that would be very critical for the departments to understand, what assets are in those regions. The circumstances for a school in one region may be different than the circumstances for a school in another region, so what needs to be done to adapt that particular facility to the impacts of climate change wouldn't necessarily be the same in all regions. So certainly getting that sense of how the impacts of climate change are felt at regional levels within the Northwest Territories, I think, would be critical to their ability to plan what they need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson, and possibly my last question is your opening remarks and presentation, point number 18. You had made reference to halfway through the paragraph, establishing the appropriate authority. What did you mean by establishing the appropriate authority?
Well, that goes back to the conversation or the question earlier on around leadership. And again, the fact that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources themselves had identified more than 10 years ago that one of the obstacles to them to be able to provide leadership on the climate change file was in that area. So they need to have the clear authorities. They identified that not having those clear authorities was an obstacle to them being able to provide leadership. They identified that 10 years ago. So, now is the time to make sure, in the course of preparing their new strategic framework around climate change and climate change adaptation, part of that needs to be able to very clearly identify who is responsible for what are the individual roles, and who has the authorities, and if the authorities are not there, how do they get those authorities?
Okay, my last question is in the spirit of time. Moving forward, advancing forward, we have heard over the last 24 months here on the federal allocation of infrastructure dollars, and in some cases, green initiative funding. In your audit, have you identified a plan to access federal resources to assist with the greenhouse planning for our territory? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We did identify that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources played a role, I guess, in coordinating access to certain federal funding. But I think really to make sure that the territory is in a position to access whatever those funds are, again, it needs to have a very clear sense of the whole inventory of its assets, for example, including what their condition is and including what the impacts of climate change might be and including what they might need to adapt. And that would include plans for any new assets as well, what might need to be done to make sure that new assets are as prepared as possible to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So, we didn't look at specific or access to specific federal funding, but I think sort of that having a good plan around the infrastructure, identifying the inventory of infrastructure, the impacts of climate change, and what would need to be done to adapt them, all of that would put the territories, I guess, in a position to be prepared to access that type of funding.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to follow up on Mr. Simpson's and Mr. McNeely's line of questioning there. When we talk about roads, and that to me is, it's a very fundamental part of my region. We have 2 roads within the riding that I represent. And so we talk about culverts and that, and you talked about 81% of reporting was done. Did you find anything in regards to the 19% that was not reported? So did they come back and say that, they did it but didn't record it? Did you find that information, or was it just not done at all? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'll ask Ms. Jelinek to provide the details, but certainly, our overall finding was that in 19% of the cases, the department had not measured the ice thickness of those roads when they were required to measure the thickness. But in terms of any other details about the documentation, I'll ask Ms. Jelinek to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As part of our processes for what we call clearing all of this information, we provide the department with our results. We give them the opportunity to provide us with any supplementary information. In this case, for roads, they did actually provide us with quite a bit, and this is where we landed. They also signed off on all of this. So this is their confirmation that what we say they didn't do, they didn't do. We didn't have any information to say, other than what we report in this, to say what was and wasn't done. But they have multiple occasions throughout the process of an audit to sign off on all the things that we're reporting and to verify that it's factually accurate, and that was done in this case as it is in all of our audits. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So when we talk about the 19%, and I've heard with my experience in the region that, we've done that, and we just didn't do the paperwork. So was that prevalent, or did you hear that at all when you went back for justification and that the department verified what your results were? Did you hear this back from it? Thank you, Mr.
Again, from an audit perspective, what we are looking for is evidence that the activity was actually done. So from time to time, it's common on lots of audits that people might say, well, we did that, but we just don't have the documentation or whatever. But we don't spend a lot of time on those types of conversations because there needs to be some sort of documentation that actually shows that the department has done it. And I think particularly when you are talking about these types of things, roads and ice thickness and whatever, it's important for the department to be able to demonstrate that they have, in fact, respected their own schedule for when ice thickness needs to be examined. So, you know, we wouldn't spend a lot of time on those conversations about, you know, whether they did it, but there isn't the documentation, because, you know, what's important is that they need to be able to actually demonstrate that the work was done.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I appreciate that. And again, it's, I think I heard you say it, glass is not half full or half empty. It's either you're doing it or not doing it. So I appreciate your comments here. I think it's very valid, and people need to understand that. In regards to the culverts and the information, so Mr. Simpson asked you about, you know, the system in place and that. I guess my challenge is that, did you guys look at, did they come back and say, was it because of staffing, or it was just because of the system when they weren't able to report back to this, or was it at all discussed? Thank you.
So I'll ask Ms. Jelinek if there was any other explanation for why only 50% of the small culverts had been inspected.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We didn't get into a detailed discussion of why culverts were or weren't inspected in the course of conducting the audit work. Thank you.
In regards to ice roads and that, and Mr. McNeely talked about traditional knowledge and the importance of utilizing the traditional knowledge out there, especially with the climate change. We're seeing our ice roads taking longer to get installed and that. So was there any evidence from that the department was looking at utilizing traditional knowledge, utilizing the expertise at the community level to help them, you know, implement and install the winter roads and ice bridges? Because, I mean, I know in my riding, I have a number of communities that have ice bridges, and then my road leads right to Mr. McNeely's riding. So was there any information notified or looked at or saw that? Thank you.
So, you know, again, in terms of the roads, what we were looking at was, did the Department of Infrastructure have in place a plan around, you know, what they needed to do on the ice roads, and were they doing what they said they were supposed to do? And overall, we felt that that they were there. As I said, there were some places where there were there's still some room for improvement. But we didn't sort of look at their to the detail of their actual inspection program to say, you know, okay, what does traditional knowledge in this area tell you about ice, and are you including that in your inspection plan? We didn't get down to that level. What we looked at was, you know, what is their inspection plan, and are they respecting their inspection plan? But I think sort of, you know, that question about how do they put together that inspection plan, and you know, what information do they use to identify how often, how frequently they need to inspect these types of roads, I think would be a useful question for the department.
Thank you. I guess hopefully this will be my last question. It's in regards to the buildings we're designing and that. Were you able to see if the government was looking at how they build these facilities, and if they've taken in climate change as a decision-making process? Because, I mean, in my experience with dealing with facilities and that, you know, sometimes it's how beautiful it looks, not how functional it is, and how it makes an impact on the utilization of, you know, our energy and stuff like that, and how it has an impact on our climate change.
So I believe that we did identify some items in that area, and again, I'll ask Ms. Jelinek to provide the details of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We did talk to the department about what types of considerations are undertaken in the design of buildings. We didn't get into the specific testing of whether those were respected. The department actually has done a lot of work in developing these NECE standards on the national front as well. So they've been heavily involved in actually leading, in some instances, the development of standards which help to take into account some of the pressures of climate change and constructing in a northern environment. The department also has its own good building practices in a northern environment, which it uses. What we did was then take some of this specific climate change elements that were identified in those documents as being important to maintaining facilities, and we tested the extent to which those were being respected. So the results that we reported on here in Exhibit 5, I believe it is, are the results of that. So it didn't focus on the construction of the buildings, other than to give the department credit for being involved in thinking about what should be taken into account when you're building and then operating and maintaining a building in a northern environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was my line of question.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. We'll go to Mr. Simpson, and just noting the time, I have 2 people on my list, so we'll leave it at that. So it'll be Mr. Simpson, then Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Simpson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I only have one question, and I may not even be able to get an answer. But you noted that the GNWT has made numerous commitments regarding climate change over the past decade, but has continuously failed to follow through with them. I'd like to know, has your office had a chance to review the new draft climate change strategic framework? And if so, does the draft framework give you any reason to believe that this time will be different? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, obviously by the time that we completed our audit work in June of 2017, there was nothing really for us to audit in terms of the newest direction that the department is trying to put together. We did comment though in the audit that they do have this initiative underway. We've identified it as a first step, but again, as far as we're concerned, I guess really that's what it is. And as I said earlier on, there are many steps that need to be done. There needs to be the strategy. There needs to be the implementation and implementation plan. There need to be ways of knowing whether it's being implemented. It needs to be monitored. It needs to be reported. So there's a lot that needs to be done in addition to actually getting, even just getting from what is now a draft strategy to an approved strategy. Even after that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Thank you. So it's another first step, and hopefully this time, they can take that second step and keep going. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Van Thyn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A little bit kind of along the lines of my colleague, Mr. Simpson. It's a bit of a broader context question, and that is, before your audit began, which I believe began in 2013, the territorial government already had some version of a plan in place. I believe at that time it was more referred to as the greenhouse gas strategy. And so I guess the question that I want to ask is, in your observations over this significant period of time, and to some degree, I honestly feel that this is a bad question to have to ask in this day and age, but I'm going to have to ask it because of the obvious things we see around the world with other governments. And that is, did you find that there was at least genuine concern from this government and genuine interest from this government to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change in order to protect our waters, our lands, our people? Maybe I'll start with that.
In the course of an audit, we don't audit underlying intent, or we don't even audit the policy, right? What we do is we accept whatever policy government has established, and then we look to see whether it is being implemented and whether the commitments are being lived up to. So, in terms of things like, what is driving a government policy, or what's the underlying environment around the development of a policy, we don't look at those things. What we look at is, what has the government said it's going to do, and is it doing it? And again, in this case, what we found were things like, for 10 years, there have been statements that there's going to be an adaptation strategy, and there still was not an adaptation strategy. There were not ways to measure whether the greenhouse gas emission, initiatives, whether they were actually having an impact on the level of greenhouse gases. So, I think the audit is very much itemizes many instances where we found that There were commitments that were made by government departments, but those commitments have not been respected, and that's what the role of our audit is.
Thank you. Okay, well, that gives me a little bit better kind of perspective, because one of the things that I'm trying to determine is, and this, I think our territory kind of comes under the microscope more as it relates to this priority challenge that we continue to have, and that is, and as do all governments across the territory, and I suspect around the world, is that we stand up and say that we want to invest in and grow a sustainable economy. I'm challenged to understand how, as a nation and now as a territory, how we can stand by that and still stand by the targets that we are setting to reduce the effects of climate change when we know that the upward trajectory of a growing economy has a considerable effect on climate change. So I'm just trying to determine that during your observations, did you find that the government of the Northwest Territories had genuine interests in prioritizing mitigation on climate change, or did it appear to have been kind of second nature or a lesser priority to the goals of the government wanting to establish and grow the economy? And I'm not saying that to point fingers at the government. I'm saying that this is a legitimate battle that we have here ongoing all the time. Would you have any observation on that?
I guess the observation that I would have is I think that's why you see now in many jurisdictions there's more and more emphasis on the whole concept of sustainable development. You know, the United Nations, for example, has recently come out with, you know, its 16 sort of different aspects to sustainable development. And sustainable development is all about looking at the economic, the social, and the environmental aspect, and trying to identify how do you balance all of those things, off, because as you said, all governments have to try and strike a balance that is right for them. So in the course of this, in the context of this audit, that's why we feel that it's very important that the strategy clearly outline what the government intends to do, either on adaptation or emissions, what it intends to do, what the measures are to implement that, and how it is going to monitor and report on that. We're not going to try, it's not our role to try and tell the government what their strategy should be. What our role is to say, you need to have a very clearly articulated strategy and one that you will know whether it has been implemented or not, and that you can report to people on whether it has been implemented. In the course of developing that strategy, they need to figure out how that strategy balances with the economic goals of the government, the social goals of the government, so that it fits into that broader context, I guess, of sustainable development.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. There's a lot of words in there that I heard that I've been using for a number of years. Triple bottom line approach to the way in which I conduct myself as an elected official is something that I've endeavored to do for a long time, and I'm hoping I can instill that in the government more and more as we move forward. I'll take this question a little bit closer to home because I'm concerned with what I heard earlier from previous questions, and that is we have a lot of stuff that has to be undertaken here, obviously. There's a lot of commitments that we were supposed to be meeting that apparently we haven't, and there's a lot that we're now going to have to undertake, not only with catching up, but also with forthcoming strategy of our own, our signing on with the Pan-Canadian Climate Change and Clean Growth Program that the federal government has put out. And so, am I clear in understanding that right now the lead department is E&R and there is in fact only 2 people assigned to this responsibility of leading the government and undertaking the new climate change strategic framework? Thank you.
So again, I think when the department is here, you can get the specifics, but in the course of the audit, the group that was primarily responsible for this, originally, as was stated earlier, originally there were 4 people. By the time we were finished our audit, which again was in June of 2017, that was down to 2. Whether those other 2 positions have been filled since then, that's something that the department would be able to tell you, and how they manage this file in general, whether they have any other mechanisms of bringing resources to the file. But in terms of the critical group that we were dealing with during the course of our audit, that's what happened. It originally had 4, and then by the time we were finished, it was down to 2.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. So that concludes this morning's portion of our hearings into the Auditor General's report. Mr. Ferguson, if you have any closing comments, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I think the committee touched on the critical aspects of the report, and I guess I would just reiterate that what's key here is for the department to have a strategy, for it to know what needs to be implemented, it knows how it's going to make sure it's implementing, that it's reporting on that implementation, and that it can line up its authority and its resources to make sure that it can actually implement on that overall adaptation strategy. And for the individual departments responsible for different types of adaptation, whether it be wildlife, roads, buildings, or other types of assets, again, that they are very clear on what needs to be done, and that they have ways of showing that they are doing what they say needs to be done, and that they can report on that so that there is that completion of the accountability loop.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson, and I'd like to thank you for your continuing support to the audit functions of the standing committee, and 6,000 hours is certainly a lot of time to spend on an audit, and we appreciate the work you've done assessing this, and it's always a pleasure to have you before us, and thank you for your evidence. We will take a recess until 1:30 now, committee. And just so members of the public are aware, we will then be meeting with the Deputy Ministers of the Department of Environment, Natural Resources, and Infrastructure. Thank you.